Chapter 9. Monsters, New and Old. Link set out from Lookout Landing barely 2 hours after his meeting with Purah. He'd made a stop back in Automotive briefly to pick up his winter gear, but had otherwise already packed anything he would need for a journey. He had his broadsword and shield bearing the Hyrulean crest, his bow, quiver of arrows, and paraglider, along with provisions for potentially spending weeks on the road. It had been quite some time since Link had gone for a journey with Spirit, and despite the dire circumstances, he experienced a thrill of excitement as he and his horse walked out of Lookout Landing's gate alone. The road they traversed was familiar, having walked it many times before, and yet he could not deny the sense of discovery and adventure he felt as he gazed out at the fields around him. He loved spending time in the wild. He always had. As a boy, he spent time exploring hidden glades, climbing rock foundations, and running through open fields. Seeing new places, sleeping under the open sky, walking or riding until his muscles ached for rest. It was a part of him. He cherished his life and home with Zelda, but he always experienced a bit of relief when he had a chance to get out into nature. Hyrule Field was the heart of the land, full of lush forests, babbling streams, and fertile land perfect for raising crops and livestock. A basin surrounded by mountains and plateaus. Once, 100 years ago, it was dotted with numerous towns and villages, along with military outposts and way stops. Now nature had largely reclaimed the land, which stretched for miles in all directions. Like the kingdom itself, Hylians didn't seem to know what to do with it yet. Small settlements had cropped up on the outskirts of Hyrule Field, particularly to the east, along the banks of the Hylia River, and Link knew of at least 2 families that had set out from Hotsno Village earlier during the last vestiges of winter, to settle the land to the south, near Lake Colimo. For the most part, however, it seemed like Hylians were still skittish regarding the expanse of land between Lake Hylia to the south and the ruins of the old castle to the north. For 100 years, it had been a land dominated by Calamity Ganon, braved only by the most daring treasure hunters. However, for the last 6 years, Link and others had worked tirelessly to drive the scattered remnants of the Calamity away. His monster control crew had members from all over Hyrule, Hylians and Sheikah, Gerudo, Zora, Gorons, and even Rito. Their numbers were small, but Link had personally trained each of them. As a result, though travelers may still occasionally encounter the odd Bokoblin camp or Lizolfil den, rarely would the monsters be a cause for concern, so long as the travelers came prepared. He trusted that Haz's team could address most monster bands that one might find in Hyrule Field. Yet, Link knew he would be making at least one detour as he continued west, towards the Hebra Mountains, and the enormous snowstorm that hovered over them. As Lookout Landing grew small in the distance behind him, he pulled out his Purah pad, navigating to the camera's gallery. There he found the image he'd covertly taken of Purah's map after she fixed the camera, with the location of the monster encampment being investigated by Haz's monster control crew. He eyed the spot, trying to determine how far away it was, and how much time it would add to his trip. The location looked to be on a rise just south of Mount Gustav, which Link could see in the far distance. He was familiar with the area, having traveled along the road that cut between Mount Gustav and the southern hill in the past. Half of the trip to the monster camp would be on the dirt road, which would allow him and Spirit to make good time, while the latter half would require him to cut through the field. He thought the land would be mostly flat, so it wouldn't slow them down much. It would take him half a day's journey out of the way, and then another half day to get back on track. A full day would be added to his journey west, which did give him pause. Purah was right about the need to find a way to help the Rito. But, well, He knew he couldn't, in good conscience, not at least try to scout out the monster camp. With any luck, he'd arrive and find the monster control crew had already finished clearing out the camp. Spirits Who's clopped in the dirt as they made their way along the road, and Link found himself more at ease than he had been in days. It felt good to be traveling, with the sun high overhead and the breeze warm and pleasant. The weeks he and Zelda had spent underground hadn't seemed as terrible at the time, but looking back, Link could acknowledge how on edge he'd felt after going so long without seeing the sun. He had never been that eager to venture into the deep caves. For the moment, Link let himself feel like everything was back to normal. A short journey out to see the Rito, just as he and Zelda had done many times, both in the distant past and since the end of the Calamity. He could almost pretend as long as he didn't look up to see the floating islands overhead, or look out to the western sky to see the massive column of cloud and snow over his destination. Eventually, he began to see the other signs of the events of the last several weeks, which he knew some people had begun to refer as the upheaval. Enormous stones and chunks of land masses, some still bearing vegetation upon them, littered the land. Pieces of the sky islands that hadn't been able to remain floating above, and so had fallen to the ground. He saw a small thicket of trees that had been crushed under one such boulder. Their thick trunks snapped like so many twigs. The damage didn't seem to be that widespread, thankfully. Yet as Link passed under one of the shadows of the floating islands, he shivered. What held them in the sky? And why did some fall? Had any fallen on people? He knew Purah said that Kakarika village had suffered damage from the initial upheaval. Should we have paid the Sheikah a visit before beginning this journey? Could he have helped somehow? Those thoughts plagued him throughout the early afternoon. During the Calamity, his journey had seemed perhaps not simple, but there had been a well-defined goal from the beginning. Free the Divine Beasts, find the Master Sword, defeat Calamity Ganon. There had been plenty of twists and turns, but that story could be summed up with those 3 sentences. Now, however, he headed towards a destination to attempt to help against something he had no knowledge of. He didn't know if he could solve the problem of the floating islands, or the way the castle had been lifted off the ground on that column. He didn't know where Zelda was, or the Master Sword, nor did he know where Ganondorf had hidden himself, or even if he could defeat him. He felt lost. He had a goal, true, but even that felt nebulous and unattainable. And he didn't even know if it would help whatsoever in his efforts to stop Ganondorf. Was he allowing himself to be distracted by the need to help the monster control crew, or the Rito? He hated not knowing. Zelda, if you can hear me somehow, it would be really good to hear from you, he said to the air. His only response was a soft breeze and the sound of cicadas from a nearby tree. Link sighed and looked up, feeling none of the peace he'd been feeling when first setting out. Overhead he could still see several floating islands of varying sizes, including the massive one that he'd traversed. The sky was dotted with fluffy white clouds, and some of the islands appeared to be at the same height as the clouds, as they were shrouded from view as clouds passed over them. He saw a speck in the sky and squinted, frowning, before removing his Purah pad and activating the telescope room. It didn't help much, but when he found the speck on its screen, he could just make out that it was one of the dragons, long and lithe, weaving its way through the sky. It was the unfamiliar one, with its golden mane and white scales. Link supposed that was yet another thing he could add to the list of things he didn't understand. Where had that new dragon come from? Was it related to Ganondorf and the upheaval? Had it been hidden away just as the flying islands seemed to have been? He put the Purah pad away, pursing his lips, and looked out at the empty road before him. Feeling like picking up the pace some, Spirit? He asked, patting his horse's neck. The horse responded by settling into an energetic canter. The sun was low in the west when Link finally caught sight of the bedraggled monster control crew and their hastily erected camp. They had set up in the ruins of an old soldier's outpost that Link thought he may have visited before the calamity, with canvas tents erected in the shadows of old brick walls, partially overgrown with vegetation. Even from afar, he could tell that the crew had not fared well in recent combat. While there were several Hylians up and about, making preparations for the night, he could see all too familiar battle-weary exhaustion in their postures. At least 2 were limping, leaning on spears for support, and several bore bandages. There were also several individuals lying on pallets near the fire at the center of the camp, seemingly asleep or unconscious. Several of the crew noticed Link's approach while he was still too far to identify, and he saw a brief flurry of activity as several of the men and women readied themselves for the need to defend the camp. While banditry wasn't that common in the region, it wasn't unheard of, and Link felt a stab of pride as he watched the monster control crew array itself in a way that would allow them to protect the wounded near the center. The crew consisted of only about 15 from what Link could see, and looked entirely made up of Hylians and Chica. Link had helped organize multiple crews such as this, often with representation across the spectrum of the Hylian races. He couldn't see any sign of Rito or Gorons at this camp, though one of the figures lying prone near the fire looked like she could be Gerudo. It was hard to tell from afar. As he approached, a figure stepped out of the middle of the formation, and Link breathed a sigh of relief when he recognized the man. Hawes had changed some over the last 6 years. When Link had first met the man in New Kasudo during his travels to defeat the Calamity, he'd been an earnest man and staunch defender of the small town, but he had also been entirely untrained. It had taken a single glance for Link to know that Hawes had barely known the blade from the butt end of his halberd. Since then, however, Hawes had become a leader among the fledgling Hylian militia, taking Link's training to heart, and subsequently training others. Always keen-eyed, Hawes appeared to be the first to recognize Link as he drew close. Link heard the man bark some orders, and watched as the postures of the nervous crew all relaxed, and even excited. After all, Link had just arrived, and his presence always brought with it hope. Link took a deep breath and sat up straighter in Spirit's saddle as the horse cantered up to the soldiers. He left his own arm exposed. There was no use hiding it, and he thought that showing he wasn't immune to injuries might be good for some of these men, many of whom clearly bore injuries of their own. "Link," Hawes said, hurrying forward. The man bore a bright smile underneath his thin mustache. "It's a relief to see you. You and Zelda have been gone for so long. Many of us had begun to fear the worst." "It's good to see you too, Hawes," Link said, dismounting and allowing one of the other crew members to take Spirit by the bridle. He clasped the man's right hand with that of his own, but didn't miss the way Hawes' eyes lingered on his left arm. "Looks like you've been through a lot. What happened?" If Hawes wanted to ask about Link's new arm, he didn't act on that impulse, and rather met Link's eyes, his expression grim. "A great deal. Have you talked to Burr?" When Link nodded, he continued. "Then she probably told you that bands of monsters have been popping up all over the place. Better equipped and in larger numbers than before." They began into the center of the small encampment, several of the other monster crew expressing excitement at Link's presence. He heard more than one exclamation about Link's new arm, but he kept his attention on Hawes as the man explained the situation. "Do we know where the monsters are coming from?" Link asked. Hawes shook his head. "Not really. There have been too many to account for groups hiding out in the caves, though the recent earthquakes seem to have created new cave openings." The man looked at Link, face grim and his voice lowered. "Honestly, it's more like they've been appearing out of thin air with how many we've seen." As they reached the middle of the camp, Link saw there was indeed a Gerudo woman lying on a pallet near the center of the camp, along with a handful of Hylians. Each of them bore more serious injuries than those he'd seen moving around the camp. The Gerudo looked to have suffered a head injury from the blood-stained bandage around her head, and others had what looked like broken limbs or deep wounds. Link felt his spirit wilt at the sight. "What happened, Hawes? Purah told me you were investigating a large monster camp up near here." Hawes nodded grimly. "It's one of the more militant groups that we've encountered. Most that we've seen have been trying to avoid fights, hiding in caves or running away when confronted, but not this one." Hawes reached up to remove his metal helmet, and placed it on a stone chunk that seemed to be embedded in the ground. It took Link a moment to realize it was a piece of stone from one of the Sky Islands. As Link glimpsed Hawes' face more clearly, he noticed the dark circles under the eyes and a fresh, barely healed scar running along his cheek. "We're pretty sure this particular band of monsters is responsible for torching 2 farms nearby and massacring a whole herd of sheep," Hawes said, looking up at Link. "We've clashed with it twice now, but we've been driven back both times. And worse, I think it's gotten reinforced from some of the other smaller groups of monsters in the area." Link didn't ask about the casualties. He could tell all he needed from Hawes' expression. Purr's map showed that it had a camp a couple miles from here. Is that still true? Hawes nodded. "That's right. Some folks had been trying to build a new home up that way, but the monsters drove them out and used the lumber and other materials to make some basic fortifications. Mostly bokoblins with a moblin or two, and..." Hawes looked up at Link, frowning. "They've got something I haven't seen before. It looks like a bokoblin, but bigger. Bigger than the moblins, even." "Hinox?" Link asked. No, not that large. It really looks like a massive bokoblin, and the others clearly look up to it. I think it's the camp leader." Link didn't know what to make of that description, but he knew that the typical hierarchy of monster camps would ensure the biggest and strongest were always at the top. That was often a good way to defeat monsters. It was easy to make them panic once they saw the strongest among them fall. Why didn't you try to find reinforcements?" Link asked. "Well, the monsters have hostages." The words sent a bolt of ice down Link's spine. "What? Since when do monsters take hostages?" Hawes shook his head. "I don't know, Link. I've never seen it before either, but from what we've seen, they've got at least 3 in a cage. Animal pen, from the look of it, probably belonged to the family that had been building there." "Is it the family?" No, they ran away when the monsters attacked, made their way south, and met up with a caravan of merchants about a week ago. I'm pretty sure these are just some unlucky folks that wandered too close or maybe got picked up on one of their raids." Hostages. Link dreaded to imagine the reasons why monsters might take hostages, and suddenly his reason for being here was that much more critical. "I need to see the camp. How far is it?" By the time Link, Hawes, and the other members from the monster control crew that were still in fighting shape came within view of the monster camp, night had fallen, which served them well. They left their few horses behind and crept closer, sticking to the shadows the best they could. The camp was as Hawes had described it. The hill it sat upon was much steeper to the west, almost ensuring that any attacking force would have to approach from the east, and the monsters had arrayed their defenses as such. Link saw piles of stones and wooden wreckage from at least 2 carts, along with boards and posts most likely would have gone towards building a fence. There was an unpainted barn that looked like it had been built recently, and a house that had suffered a partial roof collapse. All of this was illuminated by a massive bonfire in the center of the camp, around which at least a dozen bokoblins and 2 moblins were gathered. They'd erected a spit over the fire and hung a large buck over it, its fur and skin having mostly been burned away. Link saw no sign of the larger bokoblin, though he did see an animal pen near the barn and counted 3 huddled forms within. He could hear the creatures conversing in their guttural language, sounding more like barks and growls to his ears than actual words. He thought a couple of the loudest might have been arguing from the way they were gesturing, while the others around the fire were watching, and seemed to be egging them on. The argument culminated in something of a wrestling match on the ground, with the 2 bokoblins rolling about and into the legs of a moblin. A moment later, both bokoblins were flung bodily out of the ring of firelight, yelling in surprise. Link watched it all with a critical eye, looking for weak points and things his meager force could exploit. He didn't doubt they could win this fight, but he wanted to know how to be able to do so without losing any lives. He considered starting a fire, but then discarded the idea. That would make for a fantastic diversion, but he would prefer to avoid destroying the house and barn if it could be avoided, just in case the original owners would want to return to their home. But could he use his powers in some way? He looked down at his Zanai arm, flexing it silently for a moment. An idea began to develop in his mind. Link pulled back with his small force of Hylians. Once they were far enough from the camp that Link felt comfortable talking with them, he looked around at them and said, "I want to try to get those prisoners out of there, tonight." Hawes frowned, looking around at the others, before back at Link. "These ones are surprisingly tough, Link. Tougher than your average band of monsters." "Do you think they're too much?" Link asked. Hawes hesitated, and Link distinctly saw his eyes dart toward his Zanai arm. But then the man shook his head. "Not with you with us." Link smiled tightly. "Well, let's hope you're right. Now, here's what I was thinking." Link took a deep breath, trying to clear his head to focus on his task. He had snuck around to the opposite end of the camp, where the bonfire's light had struggled to reach. Here a wall had been erected, ensuring this side of the camp, where the hill wasn't quite steep enough to be a barrier unto itself, would be difficult to attack from. The level of forethought that had gone into the camp, from its favorable position to its single controlled entrance, surprised Link. Most bokoblins and moblins were rarely sophisticated enough in their thinking to put together a proper plan for defense. And then there was the missing leader, the one that Hawes had described as a giant bokoblin. He disliked not knowing more about that one. But he wouldn't leave these people in cages any longer than they'd been left already. Even if the leader was of a stronger variety, Link was confident that his crew could handle this encampment, especially if his plan worked out the way he wanted it. Though for that to happen, he had to hope he could make his powers work. He placed his hands on the perimeter wall of logs, feeling the rough bark beneath them. These were basically just trees that had been cut down and stacked on each other. He could even still see some places where branches had been broken off unevenly, as well as gaps due to their irregular shapes. None large enough for a person to squeeze through, though, unfortunately. He exhaled, closing his eyes, and willed himself to pass through the wall. The wall pushed back, as solid as it should have been. That was fine. He'd yet to accomplish this ability of his, on his first try anyway. He hadn't expected to this time either. So he tried again. Link tried to visualize himself as being a part of the wall, as moving through the wall. He thought he could feel something there, a sensation that began in his palms and spread through his left arm. But still he found the logs to be resistant to his abilities. Come on, he thought, growing irritated. Now wasn't the time for him to not be able to use his powers. The others were counting on him to get in there and grab the attention of the monsters, so that they could rush in from behind. But every second he took increased the risk that either he or his crew would be spotted. The long nails on his Zanai hands scraped the wood as he tried once again, doing his best to pretend that the log wasn't solid. He knew what the power felt like. He knew... Two things happened at once. The first was that his arm finally passed through the log and out the other side. Unfortunately, it was only this log that he seemed to be able to pass through, or perhaps it was only his arm, because he tried to walk forward and the rest of his body met with solid wood. The other thing that happened was that a horn blast pierced the night air. The monsters had seen something. Had they seen his arm? But no, he could hear the alarms going up in the camp, and the sounds of his crew yelling. They'd been spotted. Link cursed, pushing against the wall harder. His arms continued to pierce the log, and he could feel open air on the other side, but his chest, face, and knees pressed helplessly against the other logs. He heard snarls and guttural yells from the monsters within, and then the clang of metal on metal. The fighting had already begun. Come on! He curled his left arm, trying to grab the log and pull on it to give himself better leverage, but he was trying to pass through trees. Despite what he'd already done, it felt futile and impossible. Could he instead climb the wall? It would take more time, but he knew he could manage it. He was about to pull his arm out of the wall when something occurred to him. His arm had passed through one of the logs as if it were water, but now it rested atop the log beneath that one. It had become incorporeal, true, but only for the single log. Did that mean something? Was he looking at this the wrong way? The wall had been built from multiple fallen trees, multiple individual fallen trees. He wasn't trying to pass through a wall, but a forest of sorts. Suddenly his arm slipped, passing right through the log beneath it, as it too gave way to Link's power. As he stumbled forward, he closed his eyes instinctively, prepared to slam his face into the solid wall. But he didn't. Instead, he fell forward, landing on the ground, breaking his fall with his outstretched hands. Blinking, he looked up to see the inside of the encampment, the bonfire in the center. On the other side, he saw that his crew had indeed charged into the camp, likely at the first call of alarm to try to maintain some semblance of surprise. The monsters had been prepared for an attack, however, and responded quickly, blocking his crew from emerging into the camp in full. As such, only about 5 of the 9 had made it in, while the others had bunched up behind them, unable to get through. The 5 in the camp clashed with the 6 bokoblins and 2 moblins, while the other bokoblins that had been around the fire looked to be scrambling to get bows and make their way up to higher ground. Link's force was outnumbered, and would quickly be cut down if he didn't act immediately. He shot to his feet and sprinted forward. He didn't bother donning his shield, as that would have only slowed him down. Instead, he drew his sword and released a battle cry, though if any of the monsters had heard him, they didn't react. The biggest of the moblins grabbed onto the haft of Hawes' halberd and used it to shove the man backward into 2 of the other Hylians. The 3 of them went down in a heap, and the moblin turned the halberd over in his hands, lifting it and preparing to drive it down into the fallen Hylians. Unable to reach them in time, Link threw his sword. The blade spun through the air, catching the light of the bonfire as it flew, and then struck the moblin in the back. It did little damage, a shallow cut diagonally down the moblin's back, but it was enough to give it pause, thankfully. That was enough time for 2 of the Hylians in the back row now to hop over Hawes and take his place near the front. Now, however, Link's presence was noticed. The moblin spun, still holding Hawes' halberd, eyes alight with rage. It saw him and reacted quickly, thrusting the weapon straight for his heart. In battle, fear and shock were often responsible for more deaths than any skilled opponent. Many inexperienced warriors might have stumbled when seeing a sharpened halberd stabbing towards them, wielded by an enormous 9-foot-tall beast. Perhaps they would have frozen as their life flashed before their eyes, making themselves easy targets. Or maybe they would have leapt to the side, avoiding the first blow, but leaving themselves vulnerable to the follow-up. Unfortunately for the moblin, Link was not inexperienced. He slapped the flat of the halberd aside, though not hard enough to send the moblin off balance, relying more on speed and surprise than strength. Before the moblin could react to his move, Link was already well within his guard. And then he passed it, spinning on his heels to halt his momentum before he ran straight into the press of bodies at the entrance of the camp. He scooped up his sword, its edge bloodied, and when the moblin turned to face him again, Link was armed and ready. The moblin appeared confused. The creatures were rarely intelligent, typically nothing more than brutes with big weapons. He had often found quick, unexpected moves such as the one he had just done to be excellent ways to keep the tall monsters from gaining the upper hand. This moblin was perhaps smarter than the average, however. While it had clearly been confused by his maneuver, it recovered its wits before Link could capitalize on it, and swung the bladed edge of the halberd towards his right side. If he'd had his shield handy, he could have easily deflected the attack, but without it, he was vulnerable to attacks on that side. He quickly passed his sword from left to right, and swung downwards, hoping to deflect the halberd down into the dirt, but only succeeded in pushing the weapon down to the level of his knees. The deflection likely still saved him, even if it wasn't as effective as he'd wanted. In striking the halberd, Link managed to turn the blade enough that when it hit his leg, it was with the flat side rather than the sharp edge. It still tripped him, sending him to the dirt, but the weapon left bruises, rather than deep cuts. Later, Link would be thankful for that. For now, he cursed in pain as he hit the ground. The moblin trumpeted in triumph, eager to land the killing blow, but Link rolled towards it and thrust upward with his sword. He pierced the moblin's thigh, and the creature's triumphant sound became a bellow of pain as it dropped the halberd. He jumped to his feet as the moblin fell back onto its backside, holding its wounded leg, and quickly put an end to the creature with a thrust to its chest. As the moblin died, he spun to face the other monsters, sweat beading on his forehead, and his breathing ragged. Other monsters had noticed him now, with some turning to face him, which had the added benefit of allowing the rest of his crew to rush in, pushing into the camp proper. Link shoved his toe under the fallen halberd, kicking it up into his hand. He tossed it toward Hawes, who deftly caught it and rammed it into the distracted bokoblin. Good, Link thought, feeling more confident now that their numbers were more evenly matched. Now where's that other moblin? A moment later, the moblin tackled him. The beast landed atop him, pressing the air from Link's lungs as it scrambled with its swinging arms. His sword made contact with the monster's arm, but the blow was pitiful. And if it even drew blood, the moblin didn't appear to be bothered. Link tried again, but this time, the moblin grabbed his sword arm by the wrist, slamming it painfully against the ground. The sword clanged free of Link's numb grip. Swearing, Link writhed, trying to knock the moblin off. Its hold on him was firm. It straddled him, holding one arm down and then managing to catch his other arm as he tried to punch it. This too he pinned against the ground, leaving Link with both of his arms spread out to either side of him. Moblins were ugly creatures. Like bokoblins, they were piggish in appearance, with a long snout nearly the length of a man's forearm, ending in a flattened nose, a tall torso, and thick arms, each nearly as long as the moblin was tall. Their legs, by comparison, were short and stubby, though built with thick muscle. Atop their heads was usually a long, sometimes curved horn. It opened its mouth, revealing a row of sharp, crooked teeth, and sent its putrid breath wafting over his face. He tried ineffectively to kick it off again, but its hold of him was secure. Pinned as he was, his options to fight back were limited. For a moment, they were stuck like that. Link couldn't knock it off of him, but its hands were stuck to either side as well, holding his arms in place. If only they had remained in that position a few seconds longer. They didn't, however, and the moblin's leer grew as it released Link's arms, reaching instead for his neck. Link tried to beat its hands away, but each of the moblin's hands was the size of his head. His blows were useless, and the moblin got its fingers around his throat, beginning to squeeze. Link felt his airway constrict. He clawed at the moblin's hands, but the beast was far stronger than him. He desperately cast his mind about, trying to think of a way to get out of the moblin's grip before his windpipe was completely crushed. Could he use his powers? He reached for his sword, trying to recall it to his hand. Telekinesis or time reversal or whatever he needed. Care. He just needed his sword. Suddenly the tip of a halberd thrust out of the center of the moblin's chest. The moblin's grip slackened as it looked down at the weapon, impaling it. It gave a pained-sounding bleat, and its eyes glazed over a moment later. It slipped to the side, falling in a heap. Standing over the body was Hawes, face bloodied from a fresh cut across his temple, expression relieved, as he saw Link take a deep, ragged breath. "Highly above. I'm glad I got here in time," Hawes said, reaching down to help Link to his feet. Link stood, rubbing at his neck, and wincing at the soreness. "Thanks, Hawes. It had me." "Sir, watch out!" a voice cried out from behind Hawes. A moment later, an arrow deflected off the top of his helmet. Both men cursed and each dodged in opposite directions, as another arrow flew right through where they'd been standing. Finally, Link donned his shield on his right arm, and then picked up his sword for the second time that fight. He scanned around and spotted two bokoblins wielding bows standing atop the house. One of them knocked another arrow and loosed it in his direction, but he got his shield up, and the arrow bounced off harmlessly. Thankfully, Link's crew had come prepared for this. Even as Link looked up for a way to the roof of the house, an arrow sprouted from the chest of one of the bokoblins. It screeched as it toppled off the house, and its fellow ducked low, its long ears quivering. Link raised his fist to the member of his crew who had shot the arrow, and then took the moment to judge the state of the fight. Things had turned to his team's advantage, as the two moblins were down, along with several bokoblins. None of Link's crew were down, though he saw two hanging back, one with a wound in her shoulder, and the other bleeding from a wound on his scalp. He prepared to dive back into the fray, eager to finish off the bokoblins and trusting his team's archer to keep the remaining bokoblin archer at bay. But as he glanced around the camp one more time, he saw a shadow rise from within the barn. a large shadow, and one with two glowing red eyes. The giant bokoblin stepped out of the barn's open door. Most normal bokoblins were short, squat things, shorter than the average Hylian adult, and even shorter than Link himself, who was also several inches below the average. They had long bat-like ears and flat noses, and tended to be thin and scrawny. This creature bore some resemblance to its smaller brethren, but only some. It was tall, easily greater than perhaps 12 feet tall, with a torso shaped like a thick barrel. It had muscular arms that made Moblin look skinny, each ending in 3 fingers, each the width of Link's forearm. Its face was round, with its beady glowing red eyes, nearly overshadowed by its thick brow and wide mouth full of sharp teeth. While normal bokoblins usually had 1 or 2 squat horns on their head, this one had a ring of horns, almost like a crown around its head, and then one larger one in the center of its head. It was nearly naked, dressed only in a leather loincloth that wrapped around its bulk. Around its neck hung a necklace of skulls. Skulls that looked quite a bit like those of Hylians, or Sheikah. Its red skin was striped with yellow splashes of war paint. It grinned, and hefted a massive single-sided axe, with a blade like a butcher's cleaver, against its shoulder. And then it charged, right at him, as well as the monster crew directly behind him. "Scatter!" Link cried. Thankfully, the remaining bokoblins had a similar idea. All of the fighters, Hylian or bokoblin, darted to the sides. Link, on the other hand, watched as the boulder of a bokoblin crossed the distance towards him, its axe, which had to weigh more than him, held high in both hands. Like the moblin from earlier, he thought that maybe this giant was a little bit surprised when he didn't immediately try to run or dodge. But Link had fought giants in the past. Some had been mechanical in nature, while others were flesh and blood. Some had walked on 4 legs, others 2, and yet others had flown with no legs at all. He knew how to fight giants. The giant swept its axe on a diagonal chop, and Link leaped backwards, narrowly avoiding the blow. The axe slammed into the ground, sending up a shower of dirt and stone, forcing him to raise his shield to protect his face from the projectiles. He'd hoped that maybe the monster would get its weapon lodged in the ground, giving him an opening to strike. But the bokoblin grunted, and wrenched its axe free with apparent ease. The two stared at each other, Link having to look up to lock eyes with the creature. He didn't know if the others were still fighting or if everyone had stopped in order to watch the new conflict take place. "I take it you're the boss," Link said, settling into his stance. The creature bellowed in response, sending spittle down onto him. Lovely. He supposed he would need to try to find a stream to launder his clothes sooner, rather than later. Perhaps he would go west and skirt north alongside the Regencia to get to the pass that led towards the Heriber Mountains. He sprang forward and the giant swung its fist for him, which he ducked under. Before he could lunge forward with his sword, however, the bokoblin swung its axe at him again in a one-handed grip, sending him rolling to avoid the blow. The enormous bokoblin moved much quicker than its bulk would have suggested, and its attacks were quick and vicious, if predictable. As Link ducked, rolled, and leaped its attacks, he did manage to get a few strikes in, cutting shallow gashes along the bokoblin's forearms and side. Nothing that slowed it down enough to make a big difference in its attacks, however. All the while, its red glowing eyes unnerved Link. He'd seen eyes like that before, during a harrowing night with a red moon and an army of the dead. The bokoblin struck his shield with its fist, and he stumbled back, his arms aching from the blow. He had to be careful. The bokoblin was likely strong enough to break bones if it landed a solid enough blow, even with the shield. Seeing his stumble as an opening, the bokoblin tried to chop Link in two with an overhead swing. Link let the axe fall, sidestepping as it slammed into the ground beside him. He felt the ground shiver at the blow, and again, rocks and dirt sprayed out to the sides, pelting him. In that brief moment, however, he struck. Link brought his sword down in a brutal chop that cut deep into the bokoblin's wrist. It wasn't enough to sever it, but the cut was to the bone, and the giant screamed. It released its hold on the axe and brought its damaged wrist to its chest, clutching it with its other hand. Link lunged, shoving his sword deep into the thing's belly. Blood and gore coated his arms as the giant shuddered, trying to swat him away. Link leaned in, letting the beast slap ineffectually at his back, and swept his sword out, widening the large gash in the thing's belly. As the giant tried to keep its guts from spilling out of the hole, Link stabbed once more, this time seeking the bogoblin's heart. Unfortunately, the thing's bulk and size made finding its heart from Link's position nearly impossible. Though Link pierced its belly from just under where he thought its sternum would be, his angle was off. The bogoblin's fist found Link's side and sent him through the air, right into the spit and deer carcass over the bonfire. He felt the flames briefly lick at his exposed skin, but then he and the spit collapsed past the edge of the flames. He rolled, grimacing at the wrench of pain in his left shoulder, and rose to his feet, panting. He flexed his arm. It ached, but didn't appear to be broken or sprained, thankfully. He'd also managed to keep his hold on his sword this time, which was unfortunate for the giant bokoblin, who now had another deep gash in its stomach. It looked at Link with hatred in its eyes. Lips pulled back in a grimace of pain, and took a step towards him. Its axe had been left behind, and it appeared ready to fight Link with its bare hands. It was dying, but it wanted to at least take him with it. He sighed and swept his sword out to the side, sending a spray of the thing's blood to the ground, as he adopted his stance once more. Link's muscles burned. He was out of breath, exhausted. The only thing keeping him going now was sheer adrenaline. An arrow whizzed through the air and sprouted from one of the bogoblin's nostrils. The creature's eyes widened briefly as it looked cross-eyed at the length of wood that had pierced its nasal cavity. There was confusion in its expression and shock. Then the red light behind its pupils faded. Maybe the arrow had pierced its brain, or the blood loss had finally caught up to it. Either way, the giant fell forward, landing on and smothering the bonfire, sending out a wave of ash and sparks before darkness fell around the camp. The monster control crew gave a cheer, and at least one bokoblin screamed in terror, bolting for the entrance of the encampment. It was cut down, and another cheer rose from the gathered warriors. Link's shoulders slumped, his left arm slackening, and letting his sword's blade rest on the ground. He took deep breaths, trying to steady himself. His legs felt like leaden weights, and his throat was parched. Every breath filled his nostrils with the putrid smells of blood and unwashed bodies. His heart beat so fast and hard that he grew alarmed. He worried he might vomit. "Link, are you all right?" Oz said, moving towards him quickly. "You took a hard hit there at the end." Link nodded, letting his sword fall to the ground. He lifted a hand to ward off Oz, and continued to take deep breaths through his mouth. Gradually his heart slowed and his breathing grew easier. I'm all right," he finally said, looking up and meeting the other man's eyes. "Just a bit winded." "Why don't you sit down? Take a breather." "No, the prisoners I want to... We're already handling it." Oz nodded to where a couple of members of his crew were breaking the locks on the cages. The others were inspecting the house and the barn for any stragglers. Apparently during Link's fight with the giant bokoblin, the crew had taken advantage of the other monster's distraction to finish them off, just as he'd taught them to do in situations like this. Link nodded and sat down on a hollowed log that had been turned into a seat in the fire. The giant bokoblin, laying right in front of him, twitched. How had it gotten so large? Link had never seen a bokoblin grow taller than an average Hylian. Was it just a new variety they had never seen? Or was this also somehow related to Ganondorf's power? Was he creating new monsters? If so, what other horrors might the Demon King be capable of unleashing on Hyrule? He sat there for a time as the camp bustled around him. Finally, Oz came to him again, placing a hand on Link's shoulder. "Link, we're ready to head back to camp if you are." Blinking, Link realized that he'd been staring into the giant's dead eyes for longer than he realized. The moon had moved in the sky. How long had he been sitting there? He shook himself and rose, feeling his body protest, but ignoring it. When he looked around, he took stock of the gathered Hylians. Several had suffered wounds in the fight, but none looked life-threatening. Furthermore, the captured Hylians were there too, huddled in blankets and looking scared. He took another breath, ridding himself of the dire thoughts that he'd been turning over in his head, and nodded. Okay. Let's go.